Imagine a world where your child does what you ask, when you ask, all the time. This is not your world. If your child has ever pushed your buttons, and if you're a parent, they have, you'll want to stay right here to learn what to do when your child says no. Managing Oppositional Defiant Behavior, next on Speak Your Mind. Welcome to Speak Your Mind. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps, licensed psychologist with the Human Development Center, and I'm so excited and I cannot believe this is the start of Season 8. So for all of you who have been with us throughout the duration, and for those of you who joined us somewhere in between, and especially to you new viewers, welcome to our Speak Your Mind family. We begin our 8th season with a discussion about oppositional defiant behavior, which is the language we psychologists use to describe the phenomenon many of you parents have experienced. Now, you know the one I'm talking about, the one where you've tried everything, you're standing in your kitchen and you're thinking, how did we get here? And how the heck do I get my kid to do what I asked him to do? Well, you've come to the right place, and I have for you an excellent and the most perfect guest for our first show of the season. If you have questions about our topic, call them in now because you're a part of the family, and so you got to do some work out there. So call in your questions locally, dial 218-788-2844, or call toll free at 1-877-307-8762. We'll be answering your questions throughout tonight's show. My guest tonight is Dr. Charles Orsak, staff psychologist for Northwood Children's Services. Thanks so much, Charlie, for joining us.
It's great to be here.
And I want to let other people know, too, that next week you are doing actually a 3-hour presentation on this very topic at the St. Louis County Social Services Conference, which I believe is not only for professionals, but people in the community.
For everyone.
Including you parents. So this is kind of like a sneak preview for Dr. Orsak's presentation. So you want to kind of get the sneak preview, you can take some notes, and then you can go get the whole 3-hour version.
When you get the 3-hour version, you get 2 other doctors.
You get
3 of us doing it together.
Yeah, so that's pretty
over
good.
100 years experience.
That's a pretty good deal. That's a pretty good deal out there. So let's start by talking about what does normal oppositional defiant behavior look like.
Okay. So defiant behavior is a normal, developmentally appropriate quality that you want a little bit of in kids. Most developmental qualities have what I call like a Goldilocks spot, the sweet spot. So if you want enough defiance so that kids push back a little bit. So that's what makes toddlers a little bit more independent, wants them to go out and explore. It's what teenagers, it helps them separate. Because tongue-in-cheek, I have a disorder I call defiance deficit disorder, which is where kids don't have any defiance, any sense of independence, any assertiveness, and they end up being anxiously attached to their parents. So you want just enough, but not too much.
You know, in fact, sometimes when I see kids or when parents tell me about kids in my office and about how perfect they have been and how they've not caused them any difficulty whatsoever, and they always do what I say, I get that little uh-oh going in my head, which is exactly what you're just describing, that they have the chair is too small. They haven't gotten to the just right chair.
Just right chair.
And so normal defiance, you're likely to see, you said like at toddler age, which I think most parents are familiar with when they first start hearing the word no out of their child's mouth. And then also see that at some of these sort of developmental hurdles time, like preteen and teenage years then.
Right, exactly. We usually see more of the problem during these transitions from being a toddler, a child, an older child, to an adolescent, to an adult. Because learning how to accept no and cope with frustration is a very important quality to have.
And what is the best way for parents to be dealing kind of just with or responding to just sort of the normal amount of the sweet spot knows.
Okay, so I'll probably sound like a broken record by mentioning this so many times. Number one,
But that's good because
stay
that's how we
calm.
learn. Oh, stay calm.
Stay calm is very important. Take a deep breath, stay calm. And what you need to do with this kind of, with most behaviors actually, is you try to understand what the purpose of the behavior. All behaviors have a purpose. And so if it's an adolescent who wants to take the car out and the answer is no, the purpose of the behavior is likely to try to get you to change your mind, okay? And so if the means of getting you to change your mind is to get you frustrated so that you say, oh, take the car, then you are reinforcing that behavior. You're paying off the behavior. So staying calm is usually a really good first step. And then to help the child learn, and you give choices, for example. Now, sometimes this can get out of bounds. And when you know it's out of bounds is when there's lots of anger involved and when it's interfering with really important things like making friends, succeeding in school, family relationships. You can't have family dinner. Then you know that the behavior has gone too far. We measure the impairment or how serious a behavior is the effect it has on the child, not the behavior itself.
So one of the first things that you said is that if the child is behaving in a way, regardless of how old they are, if they're behaving in a way where they kind of they keep at you and they keep at you and they keep at you, and in your frustration as a parent, you say like, I just can't take this. Fine, go ahead. You have now taught the child that all they have to do is keep at you, keep at you, and keep at you, and eventually they'll get what they want then.
And the other problem with not staying calm is you tend to give consequences you can't live with. So you'll say, in anger, you'll say, you're grounded for 2 weeks, and then the little voice in your head says, oh my God, what have I done to myself? And then you've modeled behavior for the child. So there's lots and lots of reasons to stay calm. The other thing is to be firm and fair and consistent. And consistency is very important because that's what kids rely on, is that consistency, not to change track every approach every time. And then the last thing is these are teaching opportunities. You can work through it with your kid. And so you have to, as soon as they start showing responsible behavior, I always talk to kids about, you have, every parent has a formula. I have one. And there are ways you can get up the probability that your parent will say yes. You can't get yes every time. But there's also things you can do to up the probability of hearing no. And so you use those opportunities of normal defiance and conflict as teaching opportunities, because you want kids to learn to get through these things. The fact that you have a problem is not a problem.
If you haven't stayed calm and you've gotten to that frustrated point, what should you do?
If you haven't stayed calm, give yourself a timeout. Count to 10. There's always opportunities to role model for your kids. And I have no problem advising parents that to say, I'm kind of upset. We can't communicate. We can't problem solve when I'm upset. I'm going to take a break. I don't see anything wrong with that. Because then you're showing your kid that you can do the same thing. You're willing to do the same thing.
So that's actually modeling the right behavior.
That's modeling the behavior you want to see.
Absolutely. So here's a caller called in a question. What role does corporal punishment play, and is that okay to use as a way for changing oppositional behavior?
Corporal punishment, I'd advise against it for a couple of reasons. And the main one is it tends to not work. And the other thing is that it's this modeling perspective of corporal punishment. And so if we talk about the kids that have more problems with oppositional defiance, they tend to be kids that have this reactive and controlling temperament. And they tend to have a really high tolerance for negative consequences. So they don't learn very well from punishment or negative consequences. So they're kids that if you're not careful, you'll get into this aversive cycle where it's the person that yells the loudest or is the most aversive person wins. Well, kids will turn up the knob from a 6 and you go to a 7, they go to an 8, you go to a 9, they'll go to an 11. And so at some point you have to stop that. The way to change defiant behavior in kids, actually the research shows, is by teaching positive behaviors and by focusing on rewarding positive behaviors. Now, Negative consequences are important to everybody. So we all need them. That's how we learn. But corporal punishment tends to not work and backfire. And the basic rule of thumb that I use is that for every negative interaction you have with a kid, that you might give them a consequence, negative consequence, you might give them some corrective feedback. You should have had maybe three positive experiences. That's when negative consequences and punishment work the best. That's that sort of Goldilocks point.
The sweet spot.
Yeah, I'm not saying this is all rainbows and unicorns and positive things, but that's what works the best, particularly with kids that have that sort of really stubborn, reactive, and controlling temperament.
So let's talk a little bit about that. So when we go from the sort of the normal sweet spot, oppositional defiant behavior, and we start crossing over into what you and I know as oppositional defiant disorder, what is the difference between those two? How are those two kids different?
Well, how are they different? Well, they're different in the intensity. And they're different in the intensity, the frequency of the behavior itself, and the effect that it's having. So if you start having, for example, if you have a child that's defiant at home, then becomes defiant at school, and then becomes defiant with their hockey coach, you have a bigger problem. And so it's at some point they cross over in this line where it's you probably need some help from somebody to work on that. And a lot of times those kids do have this, they have this temperament. Now the other thing that can happen is, we were talking about interacting in parents. Parent temperament plays a role in this as well. So we know that if we have a child that's kind of defiant and reactive and tends to be a little irritable.
And I want to stop you here before we talk about the parent-child interaction. Okay. I want to go back to, because you described, and I want to make sure our viewing audience understands this, that kids who are actually more at risk for developing oppositional defiant disorder, or a more virulent form of oppositional defiance behavior, the too big chair in the Goldilocks room, tend to have reactive, controlling temperaments. Right. So describe more for our viewing audience what you mean by, like, what's the reactive portion of that? The reactive
point, the part is they tend to react irritably to frustration, low frustration tolerance. They tend to make mountains out of molehills, so they're not laid-back kids. They're highly reactive. And the other things that we look for that sort of predict severity are early onset. So the earlier the behavior started, this kind of over-the-top oppositional defiant behavior, that's part of it. So if it starts at 4, it's different than it starts at 14. If there's a mix of other behavior problems, this mix of kind of in-your-face overt belligerence and covert behaviors like theft and lying, those kids. And then another group of kids that tend to have more problems are kids that have like an ADHD disorder that's with the oppositional defiance. They tend to have more problems. It's probably kids that you want to have them seen and get some early intervention.
And so also these kids, like the controlling part of the reactive controlling temperament is about having things my way.
Yes.
Right, and that it always needs to go my way. And even in young kids can sort of learn pretty okay that things don't always go their way. And these are kids who, boy, they will stand their ground like nobody's business.
And again, I would like to go back. That's not necessarily a bad thing. We go from leadership, there's kind of this continuum. Leadership, determination, stubbornness, defiance, oppositional defiant disorder. So we try to just, if you have that kind of temperament, it can be dialed back to something that's useful. I mean, these are kids that are not shy. They want what they want. I call it childhood CEO syndrome. I mean, it's kind of like they want to be in charge.
And now let's go back to what you had started to say, which is really what happens in families is not just that you have a child with a certain temperament, but adults have temperaments too.
We all do, and we have them
We
forever.
all do. And so what do we typically see in terms of what the parental temperaments are that, I don't know if I want to say pull for this, but where the kind of like the interaction is the spark that lights the explosion.
Well, developmental research says a couple of things. One is if there's a mismatch between temperament, so you have kind of an irritable, reactive, controlling child and a anxious, reticent, avoider parent, that tends to push the behavior further along. And then if you have similar temperaments, I mean, essentially end up with two stubborn people in the room, and that's usually not conducive to problem solving. And so those two things. But you can always get back to thinking about calm, firm, fair, and consistent.
Because we don't want to give
that works regardless of your temperament. You can do those things.
So say that again, because I think that's important. Calm, fair, consistent. I skipped one.
You skipped one.
I skipped one because it like flew out of my brain. That's why I had him repeat it again, right? Okay.
Calm, firm, which means like you stand your ground, but in a calm way. Fair, which means that the consequences you give are proportionate to the behavior, and consistent, that you do, that things stay the same. That's how kids learn best.
And so when we're talking about, so number one, those are the tips for parenting, regardless of if you have an easy kid or a challenging kid.
Right.
A kid that challenges you or a kid that you find easy. Those are like, that's like the Bible.
That's the Bible. That's even the Bible where I work when we work with kids. I mean, we always are repeating that mantra to ourselves. And the other thing that I tell parents, and it's kind of tongue in cheek, is if you treat your own kids like they're somebody else's kids. I mean, you know how we talk to kids. Somebody comes over our house to eat dinner and they put their feet on the table. We say, "Oh, my dear, we don't do that in our family," But if it's your own kids, you hardly react that way. So you can say, "I'm going to treat you," in your own mind, like, how would I treat somebody else's kid in this situation? How would I like a teacher to treat my child in this situation? And it probably wouldn't be giving in, yelling, or bargaining with them. It'd be holding their ground firm and fair.
And so so those are the basic principles. I have a question here actually about what are the best treatments to expect that a mother expects for their son who is recently diagnosed with ODD. So her son was recently diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder. She is being a good consumer and wants to know, like, are the treatments that they're recommending, what should I be looking for? And I think that's a fabulous
So the treatments, and there's been quite a bit of research on this, and the treatments that work, there's quite a few. I can name a few. If you have a small children, like parent-child interaction therapy, it's called the Oregon model by Gerald Patterson, anything by Russell Barkley. But what those things have in common, and there's a list. There's more programs than that, but what they have in common is that they work with the parent and the child. They focus on, they take a positive approach to behavior, meaning we're not going to just unlearn the problem behavior, we're going to learn a replacement behavior. So remember, the behavior has a purpose. We all want control, so if you just take the control away, you have to replace it with something. And they work on behavioral techniques, so social learning. So like it's about learning. And the third thing is they work on communication, helping parents to communicate effectively with their kids. All programs tend to have those things in common. So.
Here's a question that says, a parent is using drugs while pregnant. Does that have an effect on their behavior later on? Peggy from Cloquet, thank you for calling that in. So wanting to know, like, what in utero exposure to alcohol or drugs has on a child's behavior and maybe their propensity for oppositional defiant disorder?
Drugs is a large category, but we know that alcohol and tobacco can have effects can increase the risk for ADHD-like syndromes that will affect self-control. They're disorders of executive function or self-control. So that can lead to more impulsivity, and that can enhance reactivity. Those two in particular are problematic. We don't know as much about these things in terms of methamphetamine, opium, and marijuana use, although it's clear that they should be avoided during pregnancy. But the two that we know that are kind of the worst is alcohol, frankly, the legal drug.
Right.
It's the worst in terms of prenatal effects that we know.
And you know, what you'll hear from Gary Olson, the executive director for the Center of Alcohol and Drug Treatment, later in the season when you tune in and hear him, says repeatedly and repeatedly and repeatedly, alcohol, one of our most legal drugs, the most legal drugs that we have aside from tobacco, is one of the biggest killers, and we tend to forget that. And in the middle of this opium epidemic, we tend to forget that.
If I can put in one more thing here, is if you have a sudden onset of this behavior in an adolescent, one of the things you should think about is the child using substances.
Oh, that's an excellent point.
So substances could have an effect either way.
Yep. Here's another question. Are there good resources available for parents to better deal with children with oppositional defiant behavior? So, like, what are some parent, sort of structured for parents and not just structured for you and me, resources?
Okay. Well, I mean, we can start from everything to, if you have a, start here. If you have a parent who's a friend who you admire, I would say, take a deep breath and talk to them about it and ask what they would do. So ask your friends. Primary care physicians and pediatricians can have advice, they have handouts. We're kind of marching up the severity ladder here. There are some pretty good books for little kids, 1, 2, 3 Magic, Parenting with Love and Logic, Living with Children by Gerald Patterson. You can do those books. And then after that, then you're talking about doing some kind of formal intervention. So the Human Development Center. I don't want to name everybody, you know, psychologists and counselors. There's lots of people in town. This is probably the most common childhood issue next to anxiety and sleep problems that we face. I worked with the pediatrics department, and this is a very common problem.
Here's another question, and we're kind of getting short on time. You guys have been doing a great job of calling in questions. You've talked a lot about parents. What role does a peer group play in oppositional behavior?
As the child gets older, more and more. As children kind of switch their affiliation from their family and their parents to their peers. So in adolescence, one of the things you can do as a parent is help your child choose a good peer group. And so peers can have an increasingly important role. I mean, we know that kids, they model each other. So I always have parents, you go back and talk to the teacher and say, who's my child hanging out with? Now, I have to say, there's probably a family that's asking about your child too, because their influences on each other.
Absolutely.
So a peer group can play a big role.
Which is also why a lot of parents like their kids to be involved in things, in activities, whether it be sports or the arts or theater. That it is about not just about following your passion, but it's being around other people who have a similar passion and they're doing constructive things.
And I think the most important preventive thing for this and many of the topics we talk about are getting in the habit with your kids of communicating, having family dinners together so that you can talk about problems. Because it's the problems you don't talk about which become the bigger problems. So if you can sit down and talk with your adolescent about, you've been sort of hard on us lately, what's going on. Now, good luck with that in a way, because you know how adolescents are. Mm-hmm. But if you set that foundation and you've taught your kids how to solve problems, then if this problem or other ones roll your way, you're better able to manage them.
What is because I always like to end with this question, and we're short on time, so it's got to be quick. Okay. What's your message of hope to parents?
The message of hope is that to recognize that all behavior has a purpose, that you can figure this purpose out, and that you have to, if you intervene early, if you help kids learn how to manage frustration, that's going to be one of the best gifts you can give them, because it's a lifelong issue.
That is a wonderful note for us to end on. And usually what I do at this point is I wrap up the show that we've just done. But tonight I am not going to do that. I'm going to do something else, and that is we want to send out our love and prayers to all of the people who are suffering out there. We're sending them out to Houston, to Florida, to Puerto Rico, and to Nevada. Our hearts are with you. From my WDSE family, from Dr. Orsak, and from my HDC family. Please take care. Thanks so much for joining the discussion, and don't forget to visit us on the web at speakyourmindonline.org, where you can find a schedule of our topics and resource links. Join us next week when we'll be talking about making change, not the kind of I give you $10, you give me $1.62, the making change in our lives that matters. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps. Thanks for watching, and good night.